In Denmark, the average worker hands over close to half of what they earn before it ever reaches their bank account. Sweden and Norway are not far behind. These are, by a wide margin, among the highest tax burdens anywhere in the developed world, the kind of number that in the American default would be treated as an emergency, a theft, a reason to organize a protest. And yet, when researchers ask people in these countries how anxious they feel about money, the answers come back consistently, almost strangely calm. Financial security ratings among older adults in these countries routinely outperform the American default, where average take-home pay is considerably higher. The math, on its face, does not add up. More taken, less worried. This video is an attempt to understand what is actually happening underneath that contradiction, because it is not a trick of the statistics. It is an actually different relationship with money, built from a different set of assumptions about what money is even for. Long-running well-being surveys that track financial worry as a distinct measure from general happiness consistently place Nordic populations near the bottom for reported money anxiety, even as their tax rates sit near the top of every international comparison. Meanwhile, financial anxiety in the American default has climbed steadily across multiple decades of tracking, even through periods of strong economic growth, suggesting the relationship between how much a person keeps and how secure they feel about it is far less direct than it first appears. To be clear from the outset, this is not a claim that taxes alone explain contentment, or that the American default is doing something wrong by comparison. Financial stress is a real and reasonable response to real and reasonable uncertainty, and plenty of people in high-tax countries still worry about money too. What follows is a specific set of structural and psychological differences worth understanding on their own terms. Start with what the tax itself is actually buying, because this is where most comparisons go wrong from the first sentence. A Danish school teacher, asked to describe what she gets in exchange for her tax rate, does not talk about it as an abstract social contract. She lists it plainly: her children's education, fully covered, through university. Healthcare, for her whole family, without a monthly premium eating into her paycheck separately. A guaranteed income floor if she ever lost her job, enough to cover rent and food while she found another one. Elder care for her parents, arranged and subsidized rather than something she is quietly saving a separate fund for. When she adds all of that up, she says, the tax rate stops looking like money disappearing and starts looking like money already spent on things she would otherwise have had to buy separately, at a much higher combined cost, with far less certainty about whether she could actually afford them when the time came. The American default typically pays for these same things individually, unpredictably, out of after-tax income, often with no guarantee of the price in advance. The Danish teacher is not paying more for less. She is paying differently for the same list of things everyone eventually needs, purchased in advance, at a fixed and predictable rate, rather than gambled on individually when the need arrives. Subscribe if you want more of this kind of thing. What this removes from daily life, once you actually sit with it, turns out to be enormous. The specific kind of worry that tends to define financial anxiety in the American default, the fear of a single catastrophic event undoing everything, a major illness, a job loss, an accident, simply carries much less weight here, because the floor beneath any one of those events is so much higher and more predictable. A Norwegian man, laid off from a mid-level job in his 50s, describes the months that followed not as free of stress, because losing a job is stressful anywhere, but as free of the specific, compounding terror of also losing his healthcare, his housing, or his ability to eat while he searched for the next position. He had a fixed income during the search, calculated as a percentage of his previous salary, arriving reliably enough that he could focus his actual energy on finding the right next job, rather than the first job that would stop the bleeding. This distinction, between ordinary financial stress and catastrophic financial stress, is one that a lot of comparisons between countries miss entirely. Nobody here is claiming immunity to financial difficulty. What is different is the ceiling on how bad any single piece of bad luck is allowed to get. Here is something worth mentioning while this topic is fresh. I built a section of the Scandinavian Reset around exactly this kind of thinking, specifically the chapter on conscious consumption, which walks through a practical delay and review system for how money actually leaves your hands, adapted for wherever you live rather than requiring a different tax system to work. If that's useful to you, it's directly at www.scandinaviansecrets.shop. Back to the story. Comparison, the specific mechanism that turns ordinary financial adequacy into a felt sense of inadequacy, operates very differently here too. A Swedish concept, sometimes translated loosely as enoughness, shapes a lot of how people are raised to think about their own financial position relative to others, discouraging the visible display of wealth that, in the American default, often functions as a public scoreboard everyone is unconsciously tracking. A modest car, a modest home, a modest vacation are not read as evidence of struggle. They are simply unremarkable, which removes an entire category of psychological pressure that has nothing to do with actual financial capacity and everything to do with what the neighbors might conclude from a driveway. A retired Swedish engineer, financially comfortable by any reasonable measure, still drives a car he bought used over a decade ago, and describes the idea of upgrading it, primarily to signal something to other people, as honestly bewildering, a use of money he cannot make sense of. Removing status competition from the financial equation does not make anyone richer in absolute terms. It removes an entire layer of manufactured inadequacy that has nothing to do with whether the bills are actually paid. There is also a much more direct and unembarrassed relationship with talking about money itself, at least within households, than the American default typically allows. Financial secrecy between partners, one of the more common sources of marital stress studied by researchers, shows up less frequently here, partly because income levels are less taboo to discuss even outside the household. Public salary information is far more accessible in several Nordic countries than most Americans would find comfortable. And while this transparency has its own trade-offs, one clear effect is that money stops being a mysterious, shame-laden subject and becomes simply a fact, discussable the way a work schedule is discussable. A Finnish couple, married 18 years, described never having had what they would consider a real fight about money, not because they never disagreed about a purchase, but because neither of them ever treated a financial disagreement as a referendum on trust or character, the way financial secrecy sometimes forces it to become elsewhere. Openness about money, it turns out, tends to diffuse exactly the kind of anxiety that secrecy quietly manufactures. Debt itself carries a different emotional charge here too, treated as a practical tool rather than a moral failing or a source of private shame. Because major life costs, healthcare, education, are largely removed from the debt equation entirely, the debt that remains tends to be the more straightforward kind, a mortgage, perhaps a car loan, calculated and manageable, rather than the sprawling, anxiety-inducing combination of medical debt, education debt, and consumer debt that can compound on top of each other, in the American default, until the total becomes actually difficult to track, let alone plan around. A Swedish couple in their 40s described their mortgage the way someone might describe a long-term work project, a known quantity, with a known timeline, discussed at dinner without any particular emotional weight attached to it. Neither of them can imagine what it would be like to also be carrying decades of student debt on top of it, a reality they understand exists elsewhere, but struggle to fully picture as something a person simply has to live with for half their adult life. Debt without the compounding categories that make it unpredictable turns out to be a considerably less frightening thing to hold, even at a similar total dollar amount. How children are raised to think about money differs in ways that likely compound over an entire lifetime. Financial education here often leans less on abstract lessons about saving and investing, and more on early, concrete exposure to the idea that money is a shared resource, not a private scoreboard. A Norwegian mother describes giving her children a modest weekly allowance from an early age, not tied to chores, framed instead as practice managing a small amount of real money with real consequences. An approach that treats financial competence as a skill to be practiced early rather than a source of anxiety, to be avoided until adulthood forces the issue. Combined with growing up in households where money is discussed plainly rather than guarded as secretive or shameful, children here tend to reach adulthood with a working familiarity with money that looks less like financial confidence performed for others and more like simple, unremarkable competence. The same way most children eventually become unremarkably competent at crossing a street safely, because nobody made the subject frightening or mysterious in the first place. Elder care removes a specific and often under-discussed source of financial dread that quietly shapes an enormous amount of the American default's relationship with money in midlife. The fear of an aging parent's care costs consuming a family's entire financial future, savings drained by a nursing home bill, a home sold to cover medical costs, an adult child's own retirement sacrificed to support a parent's final years, is largely absent from how people here think about their own aging parents. Subsidized elder care means that supporting an aging parent, when it becomes necessary, does not typically require an adult child to also become their parent's primary financial safety net. A Danish woman in her 50s, whose mother recently moved into an assisted living facility, describes the cost as manageable and predictable, a fixed monthly amount rather than an open-ended financial threat hanging over her own retirement planning. This single removed fear, the fear of a parent's decline becoming a child's financial catastrophe, appears to lift a substantial and rarely acknowledged weight off an entire generation of adults in their 40s and 50s, freeing up not just money, but the mental space that constant financial vigilance about an aging parent tends to occupy. Saving itself follows a notably unglamorous, unperformed pattern that differs from both the aggressive frugality movements and the aggressive spending culture that dominate financial conversation in the American default. There is little cultural appetite here for either extreme, the elaborate budgeting spreadsheet treated as a personality trait, or the visible consumption treated as a reward for hard work. Saving happens quietly, automatically, as a background habit rather than a project anyone discusses at length. A Danish woman in her 60s, asked about her retirement savings strategy, seems almost puzzled by the framing of the question, as though a strategy implies something more deliberate and effortful than what she actually does, which is simply setting aside a fixed percentage automatically each month and not thinking about it again until the yearly statement arrives. The absence of drama around saving, no discipline narrative, no deprivation narrative, appears to correlate with people actually sticking with it longer, precisely because it was never treated as a source of identity or self-congratulation in the first place, just an ordinary habit like brushing teeth. Retirement itself, the single largest source of financial anxiety for most people in the American default, carries a fundamentally different emotional weight here, because the outcome is considerably more predictable and less dependent on decades of personal investment decisions going right. Public pension systems, funded through the same tax structure that pays for everything else, provide a guaranteed baseline that does not evaporate in a market downturn the way an individually managed retirement account can. This does not mean nobody here saves privately for retirement. Many do. But the private savings function as an enhancement to a secure floor, rather than the entire structure holding up someone's future. A retired Norwegian fisherman, describing his own retirement, says he never once lay awake wondering whether he would have enough. Not because he was wealthy, he was not, but because the baseline was never in question, only the margin above it. That specific kind of dread, the fear of an inadequate number decades in the future, based on decisions made with imperfect information decades earlier, is largely absent from how people here think about aging, and its absence appears to be doing enormous quiet work on general anxiety levels throughout adulthood, not just in the final years before retirement itself. Healthcare, specifically the fear of a single diagnosis becoming a financial event on top of a medical one, occupies almost no space in how people here think about their own bodies aging. A serious diagnosis in the American default frequently comes bundled with a second, parallel crisis: the scramble to understand coverage, the negotiation over what will and will not be paid for, the possibility of a bill large enough to threaten a home or a retirement fund on top of the illness itself. A Finnish man treated for cancer in his 60s describes the financial dimension of his illness as almost an afterthought. Present, but honestly minor compared to the medical reality he was navigating. A stark contrast to accounts he has since read from friends and acquaintances abroad, where the financial terror of a diagnosis is often described as comparable to the fear of the illness itself. Removing that second layer of fear does not make illness easier to bear emotionally. It does mean that the specific, compounding dread of illness plus financial ruin, a combination that shapes an enormous amount of American default anxiety about aging and health, simply is not part of the equation here in the same way. Housing carries a similar predictability that quietly removes another common source of financial anxiety, particularly for renters, a group that in many housing markets elsewhere faces the constant possibility of a sudden, sharp rent increase, forcing a disruptive move with little notice. Stronger tenant protections and more regulated rental markets in several Nordic countries mean that housing costs tend to rise gradually and predictably, rather than jumping unpredictably at the whim of a landlord responding to a hot local market. A Swedish renter in her 30s describes budgeting for the next several years with real confidence in what her rent will look like. A kind of planning certainty that struck her as remarkable only after a friend abroad described being priced out of an apartment with 2 months' notice after a sudden rent hike. Predictable housing costs do not eliminate the broader challenge of housing affordability, which remains a real conversation in Nordic cities as it does everywhere. But they do remove the specific anxiety of not knowing what a fixed, essential cost will look like from one year to the next. One more piece of the financial picture that does not require constant vigilance to manage. Take a step back for a moment, because the pattern running through all of this is the same one that keeps showing up everywhere else in how these societies are structured. Money here is treated less as a solo project each individual must manage perfectly, under threat of catastrophe, and more as a shared infrastructure everyone contributes to, and everyone can rely on. The high tax rate that looks, from a distance, like a burden, is functioning, up close, as a kind of collective insurance policy, purchased in advance, at a predictable rate, against exactly the events that cause the most financial fear elsewhere. None of this is available to copy directly without the systems behind it. But the underlying posture, treating money as a tool for security rather than a scoreboard for status, talking about it openly rather than guarding it as a secret, saving quietly rather than performing discipline, is available to anyone, regardless of which system they happen to live inside. What is worth sitting with, more than any individual habit described here, is how much of ordinary financial anxiety turns out to be about unpredictability rather than actual scarcity. A person with a modest but entirely certain financial future often reports less stress than a person with considerably more money but no reliable floor beneath them. Certainty, it turns out, may matter more to how safe money makes a person feel than the raw total ever does, which suggests the real work available to anyone, in any country, under any tax system, is building whatever predictability is actually within reach, rather than chasing a larger number that was never going to deliver the calm it seemed to promise. If you want to hear what a different relationship with money actually feels like from someone who grew up inside it, Nordic Ways gets closer to that texture than a video built from research ever fully can. Search Nordic Ways on YouTube if that's what you're looking for. Och som alltid, vi ses nästa gång.